What's up guys, Sal here. So despite having placed in the US entity list, Huawei's business was functioning as usual. The main reason for that is majority of Huawei smartphone sales happen in China, and the ban had absolutely no impact in that country because Google services are already banned in China. Yes, their business in the West was totally crippled, but Huawei regrouped and started focusing more on China, and as a result they were growing as usual. However, recently the US government imposed another restriction where they prevented TSMC, which produces chipsets for Huawei, from supplying their chips to Huawei's chip division. This means Huawei cannot make their current chipsets, which also means that this is the beginning of the end for Huawei as a consumer business group. By the way, Huawei is turning to alternative chip production companies. I'll come back to that in a moment, but for now, Huawei is preparing for the worst and intends on building a large inventory of memory chips as a safety net. Although the US restriction doesn't apply to memory chip manufacturers, Huawei is reportedly fearing that the US government will eventually extend its restriction to include memory chips as well. And that's the reason Huawei asked Samsung and SK Hynix for a stable memory chip supply and wants to build a large inventory of RAM and storage solutions before the US extends the restriction on memory chips as well, which would totally cripple their smartphone business. This is good news for Samsung as this will improve the company's memory market share while also boosting revenues. That being said, Huawei is now turning to MediaTek chipsets for use in their smartphones. MediaTek, as you know, is the world's second biggest chipset maker after Qualcomm. Now, some of you might ask, why not use Qualcomm's chips instead since they are superior? Well, they can't because Qualcomm is an American company and they need to follow the US government regulations. So they are turning to MediaTek instead. Adopting rival chips is a knock against Huawei's competitiveness, but then again they don't have much choice here. But hold on, even though MediaTek doesn't fall under the US regulations for now since it is a Taiwanese company, but Trump administration said they'll monitor whether the export rules need to be changed further. And further escalation in trade war would make them change the export rules, which would make even MediaTek come under the US regulations just like TSMC, which is a Taiwanese company as well. By the way, Huawei can't use Exynos processor or Samsung's foundry to make current chipsets because the rule that applies to TSMC applies to Samsung as well. So basically, Huawei has no good options left, and if the escalation continues, then Huawei will have no choice but to totally close their consumer business, which is certainly not good for the competitive nature of the smartphone market. Huawei is the number 2 smartphone player, and with the kind of growth they were experiencing quarter over quarter, it was certain that at some point they're gonna beat Samsung for the number 1 spot, which was then forcing Samsung to be competitive and bring out great products to market. But the US government doesn't want Huawei to exist, which means if things don't improve, then we'll lose the second biggest smartphone company, nearly 200,000 people will lose their jobs, and most importantly, we'll lose some of the competitive nature of smartphone market. Anyway, let me know what do you think about this down in the comments, and as always, I'll see you tomorrow. Peace out.